Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the grand opening of the Boyhood Farm of the Jimmy Carter National Historic Site. My name is Fred Boyles, and I serve as superintendent of the Jimmy Carter National Historic Site and will be the master of ceremonies for today's program. Thank you. We have many wonderful guests, people to recognize, and exciting activities for you today as we celebrate this special event. And though the weather may look a little gloomy, we're not going to let it dampen our spirits at all. As it is appropriate to do on occasions like these, in a moment I will ask everyone to stand and join us in reciting the Pledge of Allegiance to our flag and remain standing for the national anthem played by the United States Navy Band. Immediately following that, the Reverend Johnny Raven, a former resident of the archery community and a young playmate of the 39th President of the United States, will lead us in our invocation. Ladies and gentlemen, please stand for the pledge. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Reverend Johnny Raven.
Almighty God, Father of all mercy, the Father of all mankind, we, your unworthy servants, give you most humble and hearty thanks for all your goodness and loving kindness to us. We thank you for your creation and for all the blessing of this life. Above all, for your love in the redemption of the world by our Lord Jesus Christ, for the grace and for the hope of glory. We beg you, give us that due sense of all your mercies, that our hearts may be thankful, that we may show forth praise not only with our lips, but in our lives, by giving up ourselves to your service, by walking before you in holiness and in righteousness all the days of our lives. Through Jesus Christ our Lord, to whom with you and the Holy Spirit be all honor and glory, world without end. Amen.
We are assembled here today to salute Jimmy Carter, our 39th President of the United States. He and Rosalind are so loved, respected, and appreciated by all of us. The occasion, of course, is the official opening of President Carter's boyhood home. This little community, which is not well known outside Sumter County, was called Archery. And I want to tell you a little bit about the special folks who lived here. The center of Archery was just a short distance to the west of us, where the Sumter County and Webster County lines meet. There, a community of close-knit citizens, all of whom were African American, lived for many years. These 25 or so families worked in many different vocations, but a big part of their lives centered around the St. Mark AME Church. In the 1920s and 30s, the most prominent citizen of Archery, and probably the most well-known citizen of Sumter County, was William Decker Johnson, a bishop of the AME Church. This famous and distinguished man is buried in a small Archery cemetery, also just to the west of us. Although Bishop Johnson lived and worked in various areas all over the United States, perhaps his greatest accomplishment was the establishment of the Johnson Home Industrial College here in Archery. This school, which opened in 1912, was founded for the purpose of promoting education for black students who were often denied that important opportunity. The school provided technical and vocational education, much like our modern system of technical schools here in Georgia. Bishop Johnson also initiated an organization that was called the Sublime Order of Archery. The organization was created to help poor blacks with relief measures and to help improve their lives through economic development, education, and health care. I have often heard President Carter talk about Bishop Johnson. He had a great respect and appreciation for the bishop. I have also heard President Jimmy Carter talk about how the whole community of archery was important in his upbringing as a young boy. Many of the people who lived in archery and who are still members of the St. Mark AME Church are here with us today. Most of the people of archery have moved away, but they have kept close ties with the community through the church. This group of friends, neighbors, playmates, and associates all played a role in the nurturing of a young boy who would later become our president. It is my special honor today to ask all of those who are members of the St. Mark AME Church and former residents of archery to please stand so that we may recognize you. Would you please stand? You might think the archery story ends in the past, but that is not so. Just this past September, Habitat for Humanity took the first steps to establish a new community not far from the original archery community. In fact, President and Ms. Carter assisted with the construction of these houses. You can see them if you haven't before. They're on the right as you go back towards Plains. Let us hope that this new community will become as strong as the original archery was so many years ago.
My name is Mary Wakefield Wright Minion. I was born and raised right down the street here from Jimmy Carter. We grew up together. We worked together, we played together, and I have enjoyed working for this occasion. Anything that I can do to help, I don't mind. Anything he could do to help me, he didn't mind, and so we just worked together. I think he's a wonderful person. And his mother and my mother worked together down at the Wise's Clinic. At that time, it was Wise Clinic. And it's the building where he was born. He was the first president born in a hospital. And I think it's wonderful. Even though it was a rainy day, but we enjoyed slipping in the mud.
My name is Daisy B. Wakefield King. I was born and raised right down the road there, and I used to work for Miss Lillian Carter, which was Jimmy Carter's mother. And I think this is a very exciting day for me to be back home. I live in Florida, and I just have really enjoyed working for this occasion. And Reverend Raven, which did the prayer, he and I was in school together down at Archery. And Jimmy and my husband, which is deceased, they used to play in the mud holes and they used to shoot marbles together and all that. They said a little pool, a little creek down the road there, they used to go down there and go swimming.
Everything that's being reproduced, I'm a witness of it because I grew up right down the road, about a few steps from here, and I'm totally aware of the commissary. I didn't do a lot of work on this farm. I did do, in my early years, what they call mop cotton. That was a fresh stage of how they used to do away with the boll weevil. They did with poisons and syrup, and it was a very sticky job.
Well, it's quite a thrill to me to have the opportunity. The rededication of the Jimmy Carter Boyhood Farm, where I grew up, where I worked with him, where we played, where we had a great opportunity to communicate together. I worked with him in the field, as he stated in his address.
This is an exciting day for us. It's one of the days that I can reflect on, listening to my mother talk a lot about growing up in this area and walking the dusty roads to school and to church. There was a family that was a grandmother and grandfather image to me, and they were the Johnsons. And when I left Plains after graduation from high school and college, I had the privilege to go and share with them, live in their home for a few days, no, I think about a year. And we shared a lot of that because Reverend W.D. Johnson's father had a school in the archery area that my mother and her siblings attended for a number of years. And so that brought back a lot of memories. And
Celebrating this day has been a great occasion for all of us as a family, and just being able to be in the midst and to see the diversity come together where blacks and whites can share in the equality of what has taken place here today.
This historic site, I think, will serve three wonderful purposes. Number one, recognize an individual who has become a world leader and highly respected for his efforts, not only in our nation, but around the world, in peacekeeping, in caring for other people, in truly being a loving and good neighbor. Secondly, I think it'll tell the story of the roots of America. We live in a very well-built society with all the modern emoluments, but some of our forefathers, including my parents and the president's parents, had a tough time and had to work hard to make America what it is today. And I think this historic site will be a lesson to many who visit as to how challenging life was, especially back in the late 20s or early 30s. Thirdly, this site will be an inspiration. Some young man or young woman will visit this in some future time and say, I can do that. I can become a president. I can become a congressman. I can become a secretary of agriculture. I can become mayor of the city or whatever, because they will look at this and say, President Carter started at this farm and built the character and the roots that made him the world leader that he is today. And I think that inspiration will be here for decades to come, and we'll have no way of knowing how the lives of individuals and the life of this nation will be shaped by somebody that visits here and will be inspired.
Today is a very important day for the National Park Service as well as the partners of the education program, which is housed at the Jimmy Carter National Historic Site. We have thousands of kids that come every year to learn about Jimmy Carter's life. And today we open up the Boyhood Farm, which is going to be able to let children as well as the adult visitor come in and see what lifestyles were like during the time that President Carter was living here on the farm. So students coming here and enjoying a field trip or coming with their family to enjoy the farm will have an opportunity to step back in time and to experience what lifestyles were like. Today's a wonderful day. We're very fortunate to have so many people coming in to share this historic moment with us.
Well, this is a great day, both for Sumter County and for the state of Georgia, because today we're celebrating the boyhood home of President Jimmy Carter, the restoration of that, one of the greatest Georgians of the 20th century. But I think it's also important today, too, that we are celebrating the opening of a site that will interpret what life was like for both black people and white people in the rural South during the 1920s and 30s. People of my generation, we grew up, we had an opportunity to go visit our grandparents and uncles on farms. But the generation of my children will not be able to do that, and they're cut off from that past now. And so one of the great things about this site is that it will interpret life in the rural South during the 1920s and 30s and give young people in the South an opportunity to see what kind of a culture and heritage they came out of before the Second World War.
Already this morning we have been privileged to enjoy the wonderful music of the United States Navy Band. Senior Chief Scoss and all the members of the band, thank you for your wonderful music. It is important to note that the Navy Band is here for a special purpose, and that is to salute their own. Just on the other side of those trees over there is a small wooden frame house where Jimmy Carter lived as a boy. In that house is a replica of a ship sent to him by his uncle, Uncle Tom Gordy, who was in the Navy. Thanks to his influence of Tom Gordy from a very early age, President Carter always aspired to attend the Naval Academy. As America's only president who is an Annapolis graduate, Jimmy Carter served more years in the armed services than any other president during this century, with the exception of Dwight Eisenhower. In just a short time, the Navy will commission the USS Jimmy Carter, the nation's newest nuclear submarine, which is named for America's That submarine is named for the only president in our history who has been a part of the silent service. I know that I speak for the Navy, President Carter, in saluting you and thanking you for your service to the nation. The Navy Band.
During my tenure as representative of the 2nd Congressional District, I've always considered it one of my greatest honors to work for the development of this National Historic Park. It's been a great pleasure to work with the National Park Service as well as the other representatives and senators to gain full funding for this important National Historic Site. It's been a pleasure to work for this not only because of what it represents for the history of our area, but for what it represents for our entire nation. The Jimmy Carter Boyhood Farm will certainly be one of the jewels, if not the crown jewel, for our area of Georgia. For Jimmy Carter is perhaps our nation's best known farmer. And he and Rosalind are without a doubt among the most beloved human beings in the world.
I'm Sarah Robinson, a park ranger at Jimmy Carter National Historic Site. This is the barn, which was the core of the farm. It's where all the work got done. President Carter has a lot of fond memories of growing up here and spending a lot of time at the barn. He spent a lot of time here playing, jumping out of the loft onto the piles of hay, but he also has memories of taking care of the animals here and milking the cows. The barn is a reconstruction. The foundation, there is a partial foundation that's still remaining, but the barn was reconstructed on the foundation. A man was responsible for building this barn. He was from Scotland. His name was Mr. Valentine. President Carter remembers that a lot of the barns in this area were built by Mr. Valentine. And a lot of people call these barns the Valentine barns. Most of the building is a reconstruction, but some of the original metal parts from the original barn are still on the outsides of the doors.
But I'm here not today just as a general admirer of Rosalind and Jimmy Carter. I'm here as the secretary to honor a man whose life was shaped by his childhood experiences on a farm in a small rural community. Jimmy Carter always understood the risks and hardships associated with family farm agriculture in small town America because he lived them. We're talking about a man who saw a scorching drought all but destroy his family farm. $187, that was the net profit of his farm business in 1954. And that reminds me of that old line, sad but often too true in agriculture, about the farmer who says, "I sure hope we break even this year. We could really use the money." President Carter's background in agriculture drives his work to this day, as the Carter Center's Global 2000 program helps farmers in the developing world adopt the techniques they need to boost productivity and achieve self-sufficiency. He understands that abundant, sustainable agriculture is one of the keys to defeating the plague of world hunger. He understands the role of agriculture in foreign policy. He understands and has understood that farm commodities as a human essential are unique among all the goods and services traded in the global marketplace, and that they are a tool of humanitarianism. And President Carter's work in agriculture is local as well as global. I can attest to that. 2 years ago, when a disastrous drop in hog prices threatened the livelihoods of thousands of Georgia farmers, President Carter personally weighed in, phone calls, both with me and President Clinton, to see what we could do about this problem. And his input was instrumental in helping us put together an assistance package that helped hog farmers in Georgia and around the country weather that storm. You know, when you consider his hands-on farm experience, his efforts in agriculture, his understanding of the role of rural electrification in creating a political and economic revolution in America, his dedication to rural home ownership through Habitat for Humanity, his commitment to nutrition programs both at home and abroad, his belief in land stewardship and conservation, it has occurred to me that Jimmy Carter would have made an outstanding Secretary of Agriculture. But I guess he shot a little higher than that. But you know, Mr. President, this job is opening up in a couple of months, and I'd be happy to put in a good word for you. I believe that the family is more than just an economic unit. It's a place where values are taught and learned, values like community, integrity, compassion, and faith. And Jimmy Carter ascended to the very principle of American political life. He not only didn't forget those values, he made them an integral part of his leadership style and governing philosophy. The Bible reminds us that a man's life consists not in the abundance of the things which he possesses. So it was in Jimmy Carter's boyhood home, where spirituality governed, and where he was spiritually, if not materially, rich. When President Carter was very young, there wasn't even electricity or running water. But there was compassion, there was decency, there was love, and there was hard work. The work ethic also instilled in him a strong entrepreneurial drive. As a boy, he would bring farm goods into Plains on a wagon and sell them for profit. He actually saved him enough money to buy and then rent 5 houses whose prices had been driven down by the Depression. As an adult, President Carter developed a successful peanut shelling and warehousing operation, and eventually expanded into the cotton and the fertilizer business. This rural community where Jimmy Carter grew up was at the time a rigidly segregated one. But thanks in part to a strong-willed mother who rejected the mores of the time, Jimmy Carter reached out across racial divides from an early age. He forged friendships with young African-American children like Johnny Raven, who delivered our invocation this morning. He developed a special relationship with the Clarks, who worked on the Carter farm and acted almost as surrogate parents to him. Inclusion and racial justice have been tireless causes for President Carter throughout his adult life. In the military, when his submarine docked in Bermuda, local British officials invited the crew to a party. The white members of the crew, that is. Jimmy Carter was instrumental in persuading the entire crew to decline the invitation. Back home in Georgia, where many in the community joined the segregationist White Citizens Council, Jimmy Carter refused, even though it led to a brief boycott of the family business. When their church wouldn't admit African Americans to the congregation, the Carters were the lone voices of dissent. And just after being sworn in as governor, Jimmy Carter boldly declared in his inaugural speech that the time for segregation was over. That, of course, is a no-brainer today. but it was a startling and courageous statement in 1971. Jimmy Carter's life is one to be emulated by everyone in this country. He has had a loving marriage, a true friendship and partnership that has lasted more than half a century. He pursued power not for its own sake, but as a means to advance the human condition. He is a modern-day Renaissance man, a statesman, a sportsman, and a Sunday school teacher, a poet, a professor, and a public servant. He was a proud soldier working on a nuclear-powered submarine, no less, who turned out to be one of the great peacemakers of the modern era. He is a philanthropist, but he does more than write the check and leave it to someone else to solve the problem. He gets his own hands dirty. He wears out his own shoe leather. He was there personally to monitor elections everywhere, from Jamaica to Zambia, and who knows, perhaps in the United States as well. He was there to help negotiate the peaceful abdication of power by Haitian dictators. He was there in Africa to help people battle guinea worm disease and river blindness. And of course, he was also the 39th President of the United States. Only in a life truly remarkable could the leadership of the free world be just one of many noteworthy highlights. And now he's retired, if you can call it that. I recently read an interview he gave about his book, The Virtues of Aging, which is coming out fairly soon, in which he discusses the pleasures of retirement. Now, first of all, only a man with most of the original hair on his head could write a book called The Virtues of Aging. Secondly, what Jimmy and Rosalind Carter have done for the last 20 years can hardly be called retirement. Even if he has taken up downhill skiing and bird watching, the truth is, President Carter has done 10 times more in retirement than most people accomplish in their entire professional lives. Jimmy Carter has shown that a lifetime of good work does not have to end when you lose an election. He has shown that there is life after public service, that the end of public service doesn't have to mean the end of service and of humanity. And if I might add, Jimmy Carter also shows something great about America. Years ago, there was a Russian immigrant who was a comedian who used to have this routine about what a country. But you don't have to be a comedian to see that we have the most extraordinary country where a person born without wealth and without privilege and in humble surroundings can, with good values and a good family, become exceptional. Not only just President of the United States, but become exceptional generally. But this site is also a place, as Ralph Regulus said, where people can come and see not only about the life of Jimmy Carter, but how America embraces people with values and what they can do to keep this country great. I find myself today a little bit where President Carter was in 1981, in my mid-50s, dropping the curtain on a career in government. As I contemplate my next step in life's journey, I can only hope to meet the standard he has set. There is a Hebrew prayer that asks us to live as if all life depended on you. Do your share to add some improvement, to supply some one thing that is missing, and to leave the world a little better for your stay in it. Jimmy Carter has done all that and more.
A lot of people ask me what I do with since I left the White House. They know that I build a house for Millard Fuller every now and then. Rosa and I go every year and join other volunteers to build homes. If you could have seen me about 3 weeks ago, you would have been quite surprised that the 39th President of the United States spent almost 2 days designing and supervising the building and installation of an outdoor privy. And when you go by the privy, which I hope you'll all see, I think that best exemplifies the character of this boyhood home. But it is exactly the way it was when I was a child, before we got the windmill and running water in our house. And it's oriented directly like it was. When I first finished the privy using my exact plans, they installed it facing the house, and I had to let them dig it up and move it around 90 degrees so it faced away from the house. And the last thing, when I thought I was through with this, they came back and said, "Mr. President, you've got to outline the 2 holes because we had one for adults and one for little children." So I wanted you, with this farm, to put back into perspective what the 39th President of the United States actually does and is. Well, this is a time for thanks to Fred Boyles and all the folks at the National Park Service, for the people that have contributed so much that have already been mentioned, for Ralph Regular, who has been a real hero. I have to say that one reason that this has been completely supported by Ralph Regular's committee is because Ellen and Kathy and Penny went to Washington. They made such an explosive impact on Washington that almost all the Congress members that met them said, "Look, if you will just go back to Plains, we'll give you anything you want." And so we still have this threat of sending our secret weapon to Washington if they don't honor us in the future. So I want the congressman up here to remember that we might send these women back to Washington again. Well, let me be a little more, well, I have been serious, but let me go into some small detail about it. The farm has been put back exactly the way it was in 1937. As has been mentioned, I moved out here in 1928 when I was 4 years old. My life here extended until I left for college, the Naval Academy, and the U.S. Navy. And we have been superbly supported by the Park Service, their archaeologists, their historians, in restoring this farm the way it was in those years. This was an isolated place. All of our immediate neighbors were African Americans or black families. My mother was a registered nurse who was away from home a lot. She had 2 kinds of duty. One was in a hospital where she worked 12 hours a day for $4. And when she had private duty, she worked 20 hours a day for $6. My father was an ambitious farmer. He was away from here a lot. He and my Uncle Alton, whose descendants are here today, were avid baseball fans, and they would leave every year after we laid by our crops, and they would go to some major baseball city, either Boston or New York or Philadelphia or St. Louis or Cincinnati or Chicago. I knew them all. Every year they would go to a different city as their only vacation to see Major League Baseball played. When they were gone, I stayed with Rachel and Jack Clark, whose home has been preserved. I hope you'll go through it. I slept on a pallet filled with corn shucks or wheat straw on the floor in the corner. And in cold weather, Rachel and Jack would let me move my pallet near the fire to keep warm. Bishop William Decker Johnson, who's already been mentioned, was the most successful person I knew. When he came back to Archer, Georgia, almost everybody in Sumter County knew that this great man was returning to his roots. At the church down the road, where Johnny Raven is now the senior elder, my father and the rest of the family were invited to participate in the worship service. Bishop Johnson, we felt, was also the richest person we knew. He always had a big black automobile, either a Packard or a Cadillac, and he had a chauffeur. Those were the days when the races were shaped in their relationship by a Supreme Court ruling that was called separate but equal. It was not challenged by black activists or by white liberals. There was no sense that it might eventually be changed. Religious leaders didn't question the few carefully selected verses that said that the races should be separate. But we lived in direct contravention to separate but equal. There was no equality at all. White students went to 3 very good elementary schools and to 1 high school in Plains. We went to school on school buses, and we had superb education. The black students, instead of having 3 elementary schools, had 26. They were in the front room of tenant shacks or in a small corner of a church. Their textbooks were the ones that the white children had discarded. And the reason they had so many elementary schools was because they all had to be within walking distance. Because there was no thought then of school buses for black kids. Obviously, they were not permitted to vote, to choose their own leaders. And they were not permitted to serve on jury duty to decide how the system of justice would treat them. So there was no such thing as equality. The other part of it, separate but equal, was similarly not applicable to this place because we lived in the closest possible intimacy with each other. Many years later, when the civil rights rulings by the Supreme Court and the Congress came down, we didn't have to walk across the street or the road and say, "I'm Jimmy Carter, I've been your neighbor for all this time," because we lived together and worked together. Johnny Raven, my friend, and his brother Milton out here and others that are here were my closest friends. In fact, they were my only playmates. We played together, we fought each other, we wrestled, we went fishing together, we worked in the field together. Went to separate schools, separate churches. My closest friend was A.D. Davis, who lived in one of these houses. Sometimes we would even go to Americus to a picture show. We'd walk down the tracks to archery, put a red leather flag in a hole in the cross tie, and the engineer would see the little flag and stop. And we'd get on the train together and separate. And we'd ride to Americus in separate parts of the train. We'd get off at the depot in Americus and we would walk hand in hand, a little black boy and a little white boy, to the movie theater where we separated again. I could sit on the bottom floor with the nice seats. A.D. would go to the 3rd floor in the narrow seats. And afterwards we would get on the train and come back separately. Well, that was the way it was. And it's embarrassing now to look back on those days, but gratifying to know that those times have changed. Now, basically, we are no longer unequal, at least in the law. But to some degree, we are a lot more separate. And that's why I'm so grateful that my African American neighbors and friends are here this morning. We need to reach out more closely to one another. I've just written a new book that'll be out next month. Rosa wanted me to announce it'll be on sale for Christmas. And it's called An Hour Before Daylight. And I chose this title because Jack Clark, Rachel's husband, was in charge of the barn and the mules and horses and the plows and the wagons. And he was also in charge of ringing the farm bell, which you'll see down in front of the barn. He rang the bell twice a day, one time an hour before daylight, and the other time when the sun was at its highest point, which was sun time at noon. And we relished the life that we shared. This farm has been put back as accurately as humanly possible to the way things were in those days. Not only will it commemorate the origins of a future president, but it'll show how life was in a rural area during the Depression years. Hobos passed in front of our house constantly, either hitching a ride in an empty boxcar on the train or walking up and down the road. And I think it's very accurate to say that those were good times. In my book, I spent 7 years writing this book. I contemplated these early days as thoroughly as I could. And one of the conclusions I reached was that in addition to my mother and father, 5 people shaped my life. Only 2 of them were white. And I think that every major decision I've made as a state senator, as a governor, as a president, and since I left the White House, has been shaped by the events here on this Boyhood Farm. And I hope that you'll enjoy seeing how we lived in those halcyon days. Like a pleasant dream now in retrospect, but with thanksgiving that the racial divide has now been crossed, and that we have removed the millstones from around the necks of both white and black people of this nation that we bore during the segregated years. I hope that one other benefit that will come to business of this Boyhood Farm will be the realization of the greatness of our country that can overcome the stigmas that have existed in the past and take full advantage of a glorious future where we all share the glories of the greatest nation on earth. Thank you very much. Well, it's been a great day for us. We had about 2,000 people here to help commemorate the opening of this historical site. It means a lot to me personally, as all of you know. And I think and hope it'll teach a lesson to historians, both young and old, now and for many years to come. And I hope that everybody that watches this video will come out to the Boyhood Home just west of Plains and see yourself how all of us lived out here in 1937 and in those Depression years. So I want to express my special thanks to the folks that are responsible for this film. I think the Young Historians are a great organization, and they mean a lot to us, and I hope that their work will be of benefit to many people. Thanks very much.